Welcome back to Beyond Classified. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight, my guest is Alana Bliss. She has committed herself to being an embodied agent of change through intentionally creating a regenerative culture and lifestyle. From her spiritual beliefs to her business practices to how she gives birth and raises her children, she has been a trailblazer. She is an eclectic theist, permaculturist, conscious birth educator, and doula, writer, and entrepreneur. She incorporates holistic wellness and permaculture to design supportive relationships between humans and nature. She has been a student of the mystic since she was a child and has had countless experiences that have galvanized her unique spiritual perspective. She has given birth to 4 children at home, in water, supported by passage of her late husband. She also became certified in psychoacoustics after using sound to ease her pain during the birth of her first child. She has worked in the dream time to aid her transformational experiences and personal healing work, and she is a contributing author in the book Psychedelic Mysteries of the Feminine. She has spoken throughout the world about conscious birth, and she is passionate about spiritual freedom, birth, death, and cultivating a generative culture in between. Alana, welcome. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for joining us. We have a very interesting topic we're going to be talking about. And I'm just going to kind of read what you sent in one of your first emails to give the audience a little bit more of an idea of what we'll be discussing tonight. You wrote that there's been a very intentional takeover of our childbirth since the Middle Ages. This is a critical part of how humans are manipulated and controlled. There is a saying in the conscious birth and prenatal psychology community: who controls birth controls the earth. This is because how we are conceived, gestated, and born lays the foundation for how we perceive reality as well as our personalities. And I thought that was pretty profound and very interesting. We're going to be discussing not only that, but prenatal psychology, the psychedelic nature of empowered birth, conscious parenting for sovereign children, and the shady history of birth being changed from a deeply spiritual experience to an industry. But first, I'd like to hear what got you started in looking to these sacred aspects of childbirth.
Well, I was terrified of childbirth growing up. My mother, whenever I got in trouble, she would say, "You were 36 hours of pure hell to bring into this world. How are you going to treat me like this?" And then I was like, oh, that's horrible. I don't want to be, I don't want to have to go through hell in order to have children. And so, and then also I've always been afraid of hospitals. I just have I walk in and I feel like tension around me and a fear in general. So I thought the thought of having a baby in a hospital was something I was really opposed to. Plus, that's where people go when they're sick. So I don't think of being pregnant as being sick. So I was like very, very afraid to have children. And then I was on a train and I met a woman who had been at her very first home birth, and she was on like spiritual fire. She was just talking about how amazing it was and how just empowering the experience was for her and the mother. And it kind of blew my mind. And so she recommended a book called Spiritual Midwifery, and I read that book. And I also had decided to write a poem. I'm a spoken word artist. So I wrote this poem about reclaiming birth. And between those two experiences, I started to understand that it doesn't have to be this hellish experience, right? So I'm like, all right, well, this could be something that I can do. I could give birth at home with a midwife. And I started to learn the difference between the traditional hospital birth paradigm and the midwifery, traditional home birth midwifery paradigm. And so in the process of that, I ended up getting pregnant within less than a year. And so I kind of decided to dive into it as if it was a class. I learned as much as I could. I read everything about home birth, and I got a great midwife, and I gave birth at home, and I was like mind blown and decided that I wanted to share this experience with other people. I wanted to be able to empower women and children. And so I went to the farm and studied with Ina May Gaskins. She's like one of the hardcore founders of this, well, not founder, but she's a revolutionary midwife from the 60s, where they just got into buses and birthed babies on the way to the farm in Tennessee. And And so, yeah, when I was there, a midwife, one of the co-authors, Pamela Hunt, she looked at me and she said, midwifery is really hard on your children, but it will always be here and your kids will only be young once. So I recommend you do something else. And so then I decided to pivot and poured myself into permaculture because that was creating a regenerative culture. And I've always been passionate about birth and have had 3 more really incredibly empowering home births. And I also have been a doula, both for unassisted births with doctors and also midwives. So
Now, for those that don't know, what is a doula exactly?
a doula is a term, I can't remember what language, but it comes from African cultures where it's about mothering the mother. So basically you're there to support the mom in the process, because birth is, as much as it's a physiological thing, it's a deeply emotional and mental thing as well. So when there's someone there that's dedicated to ensuring that she's comfortable, she's feeling good, she's able to get rid of her fear, or rather to embrace and process her emotions and release her fear, then she can have a really powerful birth. And so doulas are trained at things like that, like how to help her snap herself out of patterns of fear.
Very
and
cool.
Also getting comfortable and stuff. But yeah.
Now, I guess we should start with before childbirth was kind of hijacked and the ancient practices. You talked in your email about birth as a sacred rite of passage, and you talk about the wombniverse. Tell us a little bit about that and some of the ancient traditions, Tibetan, Egyptian, and so on.
Sure. So the Egyptian culture, they perceived the womb as being a microcosm for the universe. It was the seat of creativity in the Kemetic culture, and Kemetic culture is basically Egyptian culture. And so they said that when you had a really good relationship with your womb, that's where you tapped into this pure creative potential, artistic, but also literally to create new life. And so the womb was considered to be like a very important part of the culture and honored and revered. Very mysterious that a child could come out of a body. And so they had this perception around the womb as being sacred. And there were birth temples throughout Egypt too. And so there's all sorts of art that shows midwives and birthing. There's a birthing bricks and things like that. So women would stand up and squat to give birth. And there was like a whole, there's spiritual practices around that were more profound than now. For example, they believed that when the soul and the body were shaped, that they would shape the physical body, the gods, right? And this is all happening in the wombniverse. And they would also shape the astral body so that that person had these 2 bodies that were kind of in alignment, but then they also had the Ba and the Ra. So Ba, Ra, Ka, the Ba is the highest self, the part that's connected to source. The Ra is the mental self, the part that's aware of all lifetimes. The Ka is the emotional self, or the astral body, right? And so that they would shape all of those and into the physical body. And then they believed that it would take 7 days for that soul to fully incarnate into the baby when it was born. So they would do a practice, a circumcision practice on their slaves, but not their own children, because they believed that it would hinder the soul coming all the way into the body of the baby. So that's just like one example of their like kind of spiritual perspective around it. And then in Tibetanism, there's this belief that when conception happens, it's like a light kind of going off, and then that the souls can be like, oh, look, there's a spot, I can go incarnate. And so then they'll see the light and they'll come in, they'll kind of feel it out and be like, all right, so the first trimester is that time of people or souls kind of deciding if they're going to come in through that doorway, so to speak. And then the second trimester and the third trimester, that soul has kind of agreed to go into that body. And that's when there's this like back and forth between the different realms. And then the full incarnation happens after birth. So there's another culture that really honored that process as well.
Very interesting. Now, you also wrote in your email about genomic imprinting and fetal microchimerism, right?
Yep.
All right. So what is this?
Okay. So limbic imprinting. So there's a process that I've learned about through epigenetics. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in that, checking out Bruce Lipton and the biology of belief. So women are born with all the eggs inside of their ovaries, right? They're like basically like the children. So there was a point with my daughter where I had my grandbabies, inside of her, inside of me. And so this is kind of like that microcosm, macrocosm, right? And I remember listening to one of your shows where they were talking about the magnetic field of the egg was already like a person. It's magnetic field, which kind of blew my mind, because I was like, well, in that case, this is like 3 generations in one, right? So, but those eggs aren't mature. So every cycle that we have as women, there's a maturing process that happens. And during that maturing process, the cell will actually, the egg will actually draw genes or activate genes from the environment. So it will vary. Each egg is going to be unique based on the experience that the mother's having in her environment, right? And the father has the same exact process happening within his sperm, but it's more like I can't remember the exact cycle, but it's much more often, right? So what happens is, as the sperm mature, then they draw specific activation genes to them that activate certain qualities that will manifest in the baby, right? And then as the baby's developing in the womb, the experiences that the mother has will determine which genes are activated as well. So this whole process is happening within the first trimester. And so that's genomic imprinting, right? And that goes even deeper when you look at trauma. So for example, there was a study done with Civil War veterans that were prisoners of war, and their children ended up dying younger and having problems for generations. And so epigeneticists were wondering what's going on with this. And so what they did is they started to see that the genes were activated so the people that survived these really, really intense prisoners of war camps were people that had their metabolisms were slower, so they gained more weight earlier beforehand, and so they could kind of ride out the starvation. And so there's different elements of their bodies that were to their advantage in that situation, but weren't later on, right? So they started noticing this, so they decided to do experiments with mice. And they took a mouse and they gave it a scent of, I think it was cherry blossom. And every time that mouse smelled the cherry blossom, they would shock it. And they found that this pattern had happened in the prisoners of war and the male line. So they did this in the male line in the mice. And then the next generation of mice had an anxiety reaction, a stress and anxiety reaction to the smell, even though they had never experienced the shock, right? And then that happened for 4 generations. After 4 generations, they didn't have the anxiety stress anymore, but they did have a heightened sensitivity to the smell. And that carried on until the end of their experiments, which went at least 14 generations. So that means that we're taking on the trauma of our ancestors, right? And to make it even deeper, when this was happening, there's like they called it like a dump. So the way that worked is that it doesn't change the DNA, it changes there's like chemical markers that affect which genes are activated. And those markers determine, so the DNA stays the same, which genes are activated changes based on the environment, right? And so researchers were saying, how is this passed on? Because this chemical dump happens during the maturation phase of the sperm and the egg. And so what they found is that RNA was what told, so the RNA came at different lengths and things, and it would tell the DNA how to manifest, how which genes to activate in the children. So that's, for me, very interesting, because I'm thinking about this whole RNA editing thing that's going on with the Franken-jab, which you call, right? That terrifies me, because what they were finding is that they could change behavior patterns. They could change, they could determine whether or not that mouse would eat more, like compulsive eating. Despair even was something that they could create within this RNA sequencing that they found. So that was pretty amazing to me, right? So that's some of the genomic imprinting and epigenetics. And Bruce Lipton was talking about in his book how you could take the same exact egg and sperm and like make a clone, and you could have the mother in an environment where she's being loved and nurtured, and the other one in the environment where she's being abused. Okay, the mother, the genes that will activate in each of those babies are different. The one that's in a loving environment is going to have more creative potential, more intellectual capacity. The one that's in the abusive environment is going to be physically stronger, right? So as it's almost like every pregnancy, we're asking what's going to happen. Like, are we going to evolve to become more intellectual and more like creative and, you know, I'd say spiritual, or are we going to like continue this fight or flight, like get big and buff and fight the world, right? And be perceiving fear, because the baby's literally made of the mother's juices. She's literally being formed by the environment that her mother is experiencing. And so the relationship that the mom has with herself, and this goes into prenatal psychology, what she sees, how she sees the pregnancy and how she perceives herself. Is she excited? Is she afraid? Is she, you know, what emotions is she feeling? And of course, everybody feels everything. So it's not like every single thing is going to cause this massive change in the baby. It's more like the overlying, like most common feelings, right? Like, I don't want this baby. I don't want this baby. What happens, and this is a great book, The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. They talk about this. They found that if the mother didn't want the baby, that child had a lifetime of low self-esteem and perceived the world as not being valued, like not being a valuable contribution. So the mother's perception changed the physical part, like the physical development of the baby, the emotional development of the baby, and also the perception of that person's world. And then the second most important part of that was the father's point of view, how he perceived the baby, because that in turn was reflected by the mother's feelings.
So there's a very high level of consciousness even during the first trimester, right?
There is.
Wow.
The formative, I mean, it literally forms, like during that first trimester, you know, it goes from 1 cell to 2 to 4 to, you know, exponential growth to the point where you've got this group of cells going off and making a heart, these ones making a spinal cord, these ones making a brain, all these different things, right? And during that process, the more nurturing the environment, the better for the baby ultimately.
In your email, you also talked about it being a rite of passage and the roles of procreation. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So I see birth as being an incredibly powerful rite of passage. There's multiple components to this. So from my experience, I'll use my own birth story as an example. So my first birth, I felt prepared in that I had done all this research. In the beginning, I went and I found a handful of midwives and a doctor, and I like interviewed them all. I went and sat with them and I was like, okay, you know, who are you? And like, I wanted to feel who I felt safest with. And I chose like a grandmother, and I went to a doctor last, and it was a woman, and I thought she was going to be in my corner and, you know, be there for me. And she told me, there's no way you can have a home birth. You're too high risk. You're going to not go full term. It's impossible for you to have a healthy home birth. I left that doctor's office crying and being like, you know, oh my gosh, I can't have a home birth. I'm terrified. Now what am I going to do? And then I called the midwife and she said, honey, it's okay. You're fine. Your body's going to be okay. Don't listen to the fear. Like, you trust me? And I was like, yeah. And she said, okay, well, we got this. And I ended up having a great pregnancy. I mean, there was a point where the father of my son was gone, and he kind of had like disappeared. I think fear of being a father or something. And I was kind of going through that emotional stuff I was talking about of like, am I going to be able to do this? And I had, all of a sudden I went into contractions, and I talked to the midwife, and she said, okay, so what's going on is that, you know, you've got to really ground in to knowing that you want this child to come in, and talk to them and do bed rest. So I'm sitting there, I'm meditating on it, I'm visualizing, I'm talking to the baby out loud. And I'm saying to him, I love you. I want you. I want you here. And even if it's hard, I'm here with you and we got this, and I'm kind of like, well, my contractions stopped and I had a really great pregnancy from there on out. And then, there was trials and all this stuff that were going on in my world because I was 24 and living in Oregon, didn't really know anybody. And so, but it was awesome. So this is kind of my like journey to finding myself, going through this rite of passage. When I went into labor, I experienced this like toroidal field of the birth. I call it the birth field, right? It was coming from me. And as I was contracting, as I was feeling the contractions, or we call them rushes, these like really intense sensations, I could feel this like veil between the worlds kind of thinning. So it's usually really thick, right? We're like, you don't, except for death and birth, there are kind of times when that veil is thinner. There's sometimes, with like Samhain or like that time around Halloween where people say the veil is thinner, but like I could feel it really viscerally. And I started to, I'm a psychonaut. So like I have experienced mushrooms. I've done DMT, all this stuff. And so that came in, my like ability to go through those psychedelic states dramatically helped me in my birth experience because I started feeling that. I started feeling the same sensations of the world getting really surreal and everything kind of being like I said, the veil thinning, me being able to perceive the spiritual world a bit more there. And I'm like feeling pain. There was one point where I was laying down on this massage table and my friend who was my doula and my partner were all like in the kitchen and I was feeling all lonely and dejected. And next thing I know, I think I'm going to be torn in half. Like the pain is so intense, I can't survive. And something inside me went, stop. Like, because what happens is it comes as a wave and gets really, really intense. And then it calms down. And then you're like feeling the endorphin rush, like the oxytocin and all this, like you feel high between it, right? And so I'm feeling like I get to that spot where the pain subsides. And that voice inside my head says, listen, you better get up. You better dance, stomp your feet, walk around. Don't just lay here or you're going to end up, in an operating table getting cut open. And so I'm like, okay, I get up. I'm like dancing. It's more like stomping my feet, like archaically. And so that from that moment on, the pain was never as intense again. I felt like I had found the trail to the top of the mountain and I was on my way. And so I'm like processing it. I'm like rotating my hips, getting into the feeling. Instead of running from the pain, I started focusing on the pain and relaxing into the pain and going into it. Like, when we have pain, we have a tendency to like try to go away from it. But if you can really, really calm yourself down, whether this is, giving birth or just you got an injury, whatever it is, if you can relax, you get the oxytocin rushes, you get the endorphin rushes, and the painkillers come in. And they're actually stronger than morphine in those cases.
That's
right?
fascinating because, I'm somewhat of a psychonaut myself, and I love experiencing different psychedelic experiences, and what you're saying, of course I would never be able to experience the feelings and sensations of childbirth, but it's kind of like going through the psychedelic experience in itself. It comes in these waves and you just have to go with it, and if you fight it, it's going to be even worse, but if you go with it, it's going to be a great experience.
Exactly. And it got better. Like, so then I told this guy came, I don't even know who he was because my partner was playing the crystal bowl. And when I toned the sound of the bowl, my pain disappeared. Like, it's like as if it rolled the waves and left. And so I was amazed at that. And he kept playing the bowl. I'm toning, I'm chanting, I'm getting deeper and deeper and deeper into this like highly psychic state. And then the midwife says, okay, she puts the birthing stool down and she says, sit down on the birthing stool. So I sit down. The next thing I know, I see this continuum of consciousness with not my eyes, but my like third eye or my like, it was like that state, like you said, with like that psychedelic state. All of a sudden there was this woman and it was like, she was a field. She was in the field. She was the field, right? And it was every woman that had ever given birth and everyone that ever would give birth all together with me, all in one place, supporting me. And I felt like I was a part of the universe. Like I felt like that womb-niverse I mentioned, that I was like in it, and I was so supported. And right after that, I got into the water and I pushed out my baby. And it was the most empowering experience I've ever had. And there was a moment when I was pushing, when I thought to myself, oh my God, I'm responsible for this person's growth and development. What if I fuck them all up? What if I mess this kid up? And then my entire labor stopped. And the midwife says, is there something on your mind? And I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to be a good mom, And she goes, honey, you're going to be fine. And then I'm like, yeah, I am. And so, I come through it, and boom, there's this new human being in the world. And during that time, my partner, he was so supportive. He was so supportive. Whenever I would start to feel afraid, he would come in and he would get me like back into my senses. He would get me back into that state. He would massage my shoulders. He would talk to me, reassure me. And so I realized that the woman's rite of passage role is to surrender, completely trust her body and open. Just trust the field, trust the body, trust, the caregivers. Get through the fear, because fear is the brakes. Trust is the gas, right? And the man's role, or we can call it the masculine, because nowadays, but the masculine role is to protect the birth field, protect the woman. And what he does, so like if I was out in the forest or in savannah, and I'm giving birth and I see a tiger, what happens is I feel fear. That fear tells my body it's not safe to give birth. If I'm not too far along, I'll actually stop giving birth completely, go get safe, fight the tiger off, go get safe. And then when I know I'm safe and relaxed again, then I'll give birth. So it's whether or not there's actual threats, like let's just say I don't see the tiger, but I think I see it. Same exact thing's going to happen. I'm going to feel fear. My body's going to shut down. And I'm going to go, that's not going to start again until I'm safe. So the masculine role is to witness when the fear is coming up, either protect, keep the woman safe from the tigers, so to speak, right? The emotional tigers, the whatever. It could be a doctor being like, do you want drugs? Do you want drugs? Do you want drugs? Or, it could be someone being like, oh, your baby's just too big to get out. That stuff, that's the worst things you can ever say to a woman, because now she's stuck. There's nothing she can do but get cut open. In her mind, the baby's too big. So those are the things that need to be protected. So that's where the masculine comes in and says, nope, you're not coming in here. Stay away. She's in her space. She's getting into her meditation. And he also can look at her and say, oh, something's going on. Are you okay? What's on your mind? What's on your heart? How can I help? Well, how can I support? And if she can't say anything, then just touching her, and connecting. And then the babies, so that's the masculine. He's the guardian of the birth field. The feminine, the baby's rite of passage is that pure, open, blank canvas, right? Because if a baby is born into the world, and first of all, let's take two different situations. You've got the natural birth where the baby is born in, like, for example, my birth, baby's born in water, slowly unfolds, has time to get all the blood from the placenta into the body, has time to learn how to breathe, which is the biggest physiological change of our human life, right? We go from being connected to our mother to being an independent, autonomous unit. Huge change. When that's honored and it has time to unfold, the child feels connected to source, aka mom, right? Feels supported by the world because he's being held in a beautiful, safe space, and feels autonomous and strong. Whereas, let's take a traditional hospital birth. You've got a mom who's scared of birth because there's this pain body in the field. There's generations of women that have been traumatized and afraid. This woman is afraid. She's going through it. She's fighting her body the whole time because her fear is constantly there. No one's telling her she's safe. No one's telling her she's powerful. No one's telling her she can do it. They're just telling her how to push or breathe, or laying her on her back, which is like the worst position possible to give birth. Don't ever give birth on your back if you can help it. It closes the hips, making it harder for the baby to come out, but it's convenient for the doctor to see, right? So anyway, that she's laying down, she can't move around, she feels like she's going to break. They're telling her, oh, you're not progressing fast enough. You have to take epidural, or not epidural, Pitocin. Pitocin from a large mammal, like a horse or a cow, I can't remember, it's one of these large mammals, increases the pain to the point where our hormones can't handle it, can't ease it, right? Now she needs an epidural. Well, now she can't feel the whole bottom part of her body. How is she supposed to know when to push? Now, boom, C-section. Baby's problems are going, things are happening. Mom feels totally disempowered. The baby comes out, the cord's cut before the placenta can empty into the baby. Okay. That means before the baby has learned to breathe. That means I am not connected. I am not safe. I need help. Okay. I need to submit to authority. That's what the mom's doing. That's what the baby learns. The baby has to breathe or die, right? And so it doesn't have that spaciousness to unfold. So the first experience of the world is either one of complete trust, love, and support, or fear, terror, and pain. And then from there, we build our perception of reality. So it starts from the mother's perception of self and what's going on in her world, and the father's perception of self and what's going on in the world, to how the baby feels about themselves based on those things, to what the world actually is. And then all that goes subconscious, right? After that. And now we're seeing through muck, and we're trying to figure out who we are in the world. Our conscious brain can tell us one thing, but our subconscious brain is saying, no, you're not actually that important. No, you're actually disconnected. Yeah, the world's scary. You should submit to the doctors and to authority.
Yeah, I mean, especially as a man, I look at childbirth, and it's terrifying, especially when you just look at mainstream childbirth, women going to a hospital. It doesn't look like a fun experience at all. It looks, awful. But, we look at modern childbirth, and this is all we've known. But when was these older, more natural practices hijacked, and how did that, get twisted into what it is today?